Welcome to Teaching Online Effectively. I'm just going to turn off my screen share for a minute so I can just say hello face to face. And thank you all so very much for coming. I really appreciate it, and I hope you'll find it useful. As I said before, any questions you have or any comments, you can feel free to unmute and jump into the conversation, or you can also feel free to type in the chat box if you feel more comfortable doing that. Feel free to keep your camera on or keep it off, whatever is more comfortable for you. I'm actually going to turn my camera off right now and screen share because I am always a little concerned about the bandwidth when I'm presenting, and I don't want to lose connection. So this session is being recorded, just to let you know. And let's just start off with a little introduction. I know a lot of you already, so I don't probably need to give a big long introduction, but I want you to know that I have a very great deal of knowledge in this particular subject area. I have an earned certificate from UCSD in teaching online. I've taught online courses for almost a decade, and I was the faculty development person for our entire online program at the former institution, where I did all the faculty development training for our online instructors. And I also worked at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles as an instructional technologist. So I have mad tech skills and quite a bit of experience in the actual teaching of online courses. Even though tonight's session is more about the teaching than the technology, I also would like our instructional designer, Kay Monteith, to introduce herself and explain a little bit about what she can do for you.
Hi, everyone. I, like Rosemary said, I'm the instructional designer. I've been with the department just about 2 years, coming up on 2 years. And I'm there to help you with converting your face-to-face lectures to online, giving you ideas, just course development in general. So any kind of questions you have or needs for any kind of development of your PowerPoints or your course, I'm happy to help.
Great, thank you. So I usually like to start off with a little bit of an icebreaker, and I'm going to ask you to go into a breakout room and just chat for a couple of minutes. We won't take very long with this, to talk about what your main concerns or some of your concerns are related to moving to online teaching. I know we all had to do it because of COVID, but as we move forward and as this starts to become more of a norm, what are some of your concerns? Looks like we're all back, so welcome back. I'm just going to ask if you wouldn't mind selecting one person from your group to share what your thoughts are and what things you shared in your smaller conversations. So what are some of those concerns? The breakout room one was Dr. Liu, Dr. Carpio, and Dr. DeBay. Who's going to talk to us from your group?
Gee, I thought Mark was volunteering since he was there. That's probably not fair. Did you want to explain or report a little bit back, Mark?
Yeah, I can say that. I mean, Maggie actually presented that pretty well, but I think we all thought that we wanted to learn more interactive techniques on doing online teaching, because that's one of the challenges in online teaching. It's it's more difficult to engage students and get participation. So we talked about different tools that we already know, like Kahoot or the poll tool in Zoom, or even the breakout room. So, and then one of the challenges is to handle and use all these without being overwhelmed by the tools, and so that you can still focus on the content.
Thank you.
By the way, Maggie and I both agreed, Mark really is on the beach. We want to be where he's at.
He's got a little virtual video behind him with the waves and everything. How about from breakout room 3, or breakout room 2, who's going to share with us from that group? That was your group, Kay.
Okay, I was strong-armed into reporting back, so I will. we talked about several things, but the one that all three of us really brought up simultaneously just about was not being able to read the room, not being able to see body language, facial expressions. Are they getting it? Aren't they getting it? Just teaching to that deafening silence.
Yeah, that's always a challenge. And especially in a synchronous environment like this one, where you know people are out there, but you can't see them, you don't hear from them. How about breakout room 3? That was Dr. Chang and Dr. Petrie. Any additional thoughts about some concerns you have related to moving to online learning?
Yeah, I'm Dr. Petrie. How's it going, guys?
Hi.
And yeah, I just want to take this time to say I love Dr. DeBay's background with the waves and the beach. It's just so relaxing. All our meetings are just a lot easier because of that.
Oh, it's the same.
I would say, like, for me, like with the Zoom, it's very difficult, like exactly what she just said. It's very difficult to engage the room on like how everybody's incorporating all the material. The other thing is just the technicality of running a Zoom, sharing your screen, and then it's like having the share screen, like if you go to a different tab, it then gets lost and nobody sees what you're doing. It's little things like that. It's just learning the technicality of it.
Right, and having to be, ambidextrous, trying to deal with multiple screens and things at the same time.
Yeah.
So the technology, somebody wrote in the chat box, the technology is still an issue. Of course it is. I think those are all concerns that I hear a lot from online educators. Long before COVID, people who were moving to online teaching were always concerned that their sort of bag of tricks that they were used to relying on in the classroom wouldn't necessarily work in an online environment. So how do I get the same level of student engagement? How do I get the same level of interaction? All of those things are common concerns. So because, of course, I always have to do learning outcomes, and by the end of this session, I'm hoping that you will have an opportunity to define what online learning really is, to look at some ways to create learning engagement within your online learning environment, to develop methods for creating community within an online learning community, and just to investigate a few tips for online learning. So as I said, this session, for those of you that aren't aware, is the third session in a series on teaching innovation. So the first 2 sessions devoted a lot of energy on the technology side of it, but tonight we're turning our focus a little more to the pedagogy. And we'll be having some additional sessions coming up as well. So like online learning may mean many different things to different people. It has been practiced for more than 2 decades by many thousands of educators and students who've built up quite a large body of expertise and evidence that if done right, it can be effective. In fact, most of the research points to the fact that online learning, if done in the correct way, is equal to face-to-face learning. But what we know also from a Department of Education study, that it actually blended learning, which is what we're moving to here at UCR, which is where some of the learning is face-to-face and some of it is online, that is actually more effective than either solely online learning or solely face-to-face learning. So what is online learning? Well, we know what it's not. So it is not just putting content online. So I just take my slides or a panopto of last year's lecture and throw it up online. That is not online learning. Simply broadcasting your session live and letting students attend via Zoom, also not necessarily online learning. It's a great tool, don't get me wrong, I'm using it right now, but it should not be the only arrow in your quiver. So it's really simply letting people watch a lecture that's happening live from home is not all that different than having them watch a video. So otherwise you could just point into a bunch of videos. So simply doing it that way is not necessarily online learning. The other thing I like to stress, and I know I've said this for those of you who've taken the whole series, you've heard me say this before, But I really want to reiterate this idea that what we have seen during COVID is not effective online teaching. It was legions of dedicated people doing the very best they could to deliver content they had built for a face-to-face classroom using whatever technology and whatever rudimentary practices they had to master that in a ridiculously short period of time. So I beg people not to judge your online learning experience based on what you have experienced as an educator or what your students have experienced during this COVID time. Neither faculty nor students are well suited to thrive in this kind of environment. So a lot of faculty have never taught in an online environment before. Most had never even taken an online course before. Many had not had any training or any preparation to teach online. They were just thrown into the crucible. So, you know, another factor of what I refer to as remote crisis teaching, which is what we're doing right now, is usually when students sign up for an online course, they know they're signing up for an online course. They're prepared for online learning, and they usually have some idea of what that's going to entail. Most of the students during this crisis did not sign up for online learning. They signed up for what they thought was going to be a normal year of education, and we all thought it was going to be a normal year, and suddenly nothing was normal anymore, and nobody was ready for that. So we were suddenly faced, both students and faculty were suddenly faced with having to pick up new survival skills. They may have had to create a workspace in their home, compete with other people in the household for bandwidth, care for children or other loved ones, or even been faced with economic hardships due to lack of income in the household. But working from home, all of those issues, and that applies equally to both faculty and students, may be facing additional challenges that you wouldn't face necessarily in a normal online learning environment. So this is not that. Also remember that teaching by its very nature is interactive. You know, it's a communicative process. If all you do is put content online, whether in real time or not, and call that online teaching, you might as well just send the students to the library or have them take a correspondence course. What we're trying to accomplish isn't to transfer content from a face-to-face class to an online environment, but what we're really trying to do is reimagine what learning looks like in an online environment. So that's really the important element that is sometimes missing from online education, especially when we're in a crunch and we're just throwing things up there as quickly as we possibly can. Or we're just using Zoom because we had no choice. We had no time to do anything else. So research on online learning shows that interaction among students and between the students and the instructor is critically important for both student satisfaction and learning and retention of what they've learned. So we look at that from three aspects. One is the student to the content. So how will the students engage with the course content? You have a large range of possibilities, including, you know, reading and watching videos and listening and doing interactive things. There's lots of opportunities to interact, not just passively view it, but to find ways to interact with it. The second component is the student to instructor interaction. How will the students engage with you in your role as an educator? And again, is there a method that students have for asking you questions? Will that be done in real time, or are you going to do that asynchronously? In other words, are they going to email you and you can email them back? Or are you going to have online office hours? Or are you going to find a way to do that? We have some guides and some materials on the Office of Faculty website that can help you with some of these tools as well. And then finally, and probably most importantly, and this is the section that kind of got ignored when we moved to crisis teaching, is the student-to-student interaction. And we're going to talk about a lot of strategies for that in this session. You know, strategies are very important to have that student-to-student interaction. It's part of learning. So meaningful and planned student interaction based on course content, topic areas that offer an opportunity for students to learn from and with their peers in a collaborative learning process, which is the most efficacious way to learn. So we're going to talk a little bit about some keys to effective online teaching. And the first is learner engagement. So some of you said that, how do we keep learners engaged? So I want to ask about engaging students in an online environment. What delivery method will work best? And one of the things I want to again stress is that it isn't necessarily one is better than the other, because both have pros and cons. So one of the things you want to think about is whether a synchronous session in real time, like we're doing right now, is best, or is an asynchronous session where students can do the work at a time of their own convenience. Is that better? So synchronous sessions allow you to engage with the learner in real time. Learners can feel a little less isolated because they can see video from their peers, assuming they turn their cameras on. But as I'm sure you've noticed, a lot of students don't. And right here tonight, we only have 2 people right now with their cameras on. So learners can ask questions and get an answer immediately rather than having to wait for someone to post to a discussion board or respond to an email. But actually, asynchronous offers a lot more flexibility. Learners can choose a time of day or night that suits their schedule. They can do learning in a self-paced manner. They can slow down or speed up a session as needed. A lot of times we hear from faculty who teach in year 1 that it's challenging because the learners come in with very different levels of basic science knowledge. There was a big difference between someone who had a hard science degree as their undergraduate degree and someone who maybe majored in sociology or something that was a little softer. They've got a lot more ground to make up. So sometimes asynchronous learning is better because a student who really knows the content can move quickly through it. A student who needs more time can take as much time as they need. And also, it's actually more inclusive to do asynchronous learning, which is a critically important thing for us to be thinking about. Because again, our commitment to diversity and inclusive teaching practices also went out the window during COVID. And this is one that you really need to bring back in. Because remember that not all students have the same access to high-speed internet. I've heard in meetings now several times people saying we need to make guidelines for student participation in Zoom sessions. We need to make it a requirement that students leave their cameras on, et cetera, et cetera. I will always oppose that idea because of this issue of accessibility. Not all learners have the same access to high-speed internet, and having your camera on gobbles up bandwidth. So I was in a meeting with a student just a few weeks ago that said their audio broke up, and she said, I'm sharing, with 5 other people in my household who are working and studying from home. So, they might find it easier to be able to go on at a time when not everybody in their household is on. It actually shows that there's increased cognitive engagements because student has more time to reflect and engage with the material. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And of course, another advantage is you can work out any technical issues in advance. If something goes wrong in a real-time session, you may not be able to resolve it in time to salvage that session, but in asynchronous, you plan it out ahead. So another part of learner engagement is setting very clear expectations. Often what we see is students' complaints arise from unrealistic expectations. While they may think that something should take less time than it's going to take, they believe that it's going to be easier. I saw some notes today from a block directors meeting where students were saying that we should be incorporating more of the materials that they use, like Sketchy. So again, what are the expectations, and have those been clearly communicated to your students? It's also very helpful to be clear about how much time on task the students will need to complete their online portion of their work. So when you're designing the online or self-directed portion of the course, if you normally teach a 2-hour session and decide to move everything online, you can't move all the content online and then still hold a 2-hour face-to-face session. If you do, you just doubled the student's workload for that week. So one of the things I said before is you have many different options about how you put content online. Another thing that I like to stress is it doesn't have to be all or nothing. So if I have an hour-long lecture normally, a face-to-face lecture, I could maybe do like a 20-minute asynchronous unit that I put online. And then maybe I could hold a Zoom session for 40 minutes. And then I've got the best of both worlds, right? I've got the asynchronous content that they can do at their own pace. And then I've got the live interactive element where they can ask questions in real time. And, you know, you can really think in terms of how do I parse out the time that I would normally be spending. And also, you want to reconsider time limits that you give for certain tasks. So if in a face-to-face environment, I would sort of say, okay, I'm going to give students 24 hours to turn this in, or I'm going to give them a week to do this, you might reconsider and give them a little more time, because in online learning, it takes a little bit more time, especially for students who are ill used to working in an online environment. So one of the places where this might be a factor for us would be in the weekly quizzes. You know, the amount of time that we allow for each question maybe could be slightly increased. That might be something to consider. Written content is a really important part of any online teaching environment. You have to use a sort of warm, authentic voice. Consider your tone, be conversational, but be clear. Don't write like you're writing a textbook or a scientific paper. Be really reader-centered. You know, it's very important that you write out instructions, and also Kay will tell you, it's extremely helpful to create guideposts for students, writing things like, click here to enter the lesson content. It may seem obvious to you, but it may not be obvious to the learner where they're supposed to go. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So here's an example. I know I've used this one before, but you know, which one sounds better? You failed to take this week's required quiz, which sounds like I just slapped your hand with a ruler. Or, you know, just a friendly reminder, you need to take the quiz before you move on to the next module. Contact me if you have any questions or need any help. So the written content, very important in creating learner engagement and a feeling of human presence in your course. When you're doing face-to-face instruction, you don't just put up your PowerPoint and not say anything, but that's sometimes what happens in online sessions. People just throw the content up there and let that speak for themselves. It's really easy to create a short, 1 to 2 minute video explaining your expectations, explaining to students what they're going to do this week or in this session, just really short overview, just like you might do in a face-to-face class when you come in and say, okay, today we're going to do this. I'm going to talk about these issues. Then we're going to look at a case study. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. It's just sort of our normal habit when we're teaching face-to-face, but people often forget to do those kinds of things when they're teaching in an online environment. It's equally important, if not more important, because the students can't put their hand up as easily and say, wait a minute, could you go back and explain that again? Reconsider, again, some of your rules. Give students as much freedom as you possibly can. One of the advantages of online learning is that it has great flexibility. So, for example, if you normally only give out materials, on a Monday for a Tuesday session or for a Wednesday session, think about submitting all those materials at the beginning of the week so that the students can decide when they want to work on it. And they can work ahead if they have time, or they can go back if they need to. Those are all really important issues to think about. As much freedom as you can reasonably give. Most experts in online learning agree that the discussion board is where some of the most important learning happens in an online class. So educators who use discussion boards estimate that their interaction with students can be as much as 3 times the interaction in their face-to-face courses. And that peer-to-peer interaction is many more times that. So I know that sounds like it's crazy. If you've never taken an online course, it's like, how can that be that they're interacting more in an online environment? There are actually more opportunities for students to interact with each other online than sitting in a classroom where, they're only really sitting next to 2 or 3 people around them. But in an online environment, they can talk to everyone in the class. So discussion board, many people think, and I am one of them, that the discussion board is the heart and soul of an online learning environment. It's where a lot of really important learning happens. And when you're doing your discussion board, you want to think about formulating prompts, that questions that allow for discussion, just as you would when you're formulating prompts in your face-to-face class. You know, trying to find ways to encourage students to share what they're finding challenging, what their learning goals are, what they still need to know, what questions still remain, things that you might ask in a minute paper or something in a face-to-face class. You can ask those questions online in a discussion forum. Or if you're doing a synchronous session like we did tonight, you can break students out into breakout rooms and have them talk about those things among themselves and then come back and report back to the larger group. Those are all useful tools. And I would say that even if a learner emails you a question, and they will, and there's nothing wrong with that, when you respond to them, in addition to sending back the email, you might want to copy and paste the question and the answer and post it online. Because again, in a face-to-face class, if a student asks a question, everybody heard the question and everybody gets to hear the answer. So everyone benefits from that question and the answer you gave. So you want to make sure that you're sort of replicating that in an online environment so that all the students can benefit from both the question and the answer. And again, if someone asks you a question anonymously, you don't have to say who it was. So it's especially important if they asked you privately. So in a Zoom session, if, for example, you can, obviously you can do a private message. You don't have to do, the Zoom. You don't have to do the. You don't have to post back the answer to the entire class. But you can respond and say, hey, somebody brought up a really interesting point in the chat box. Of course, you do not want to say who it was because they went out of their way to try to keep that private. So I got a little distracted because there was an interesting question in the chat box. So when I talk about a discussion board, the discussion board really is a feature of the online asynchronous learning environment. So if all you're doing is teaching synchronously in a Zoom session, then you've got other ways to engage students in discussion, such as breakout rooms and asking them polling questions and asking them to unmute and respond if you call on them specifically. So the discussion board itself is a different animal and it primarily lives in an asynchronous environment. But you might want to consider, again, it doesn't have to be all or nothing. So even if you're teaching a synchronous session, you can still take advantage of the fact that there's some asynchronous work that the students could also engage in. Every early data, I've been, of course, following online learning since the COVID crisis, and early data from this spring's experience moving everyone online all at once reveal that most of the students spent their time watching videos of the same lectures in the same way that faculty would have given them if they were in the face-to-face classroom. And students found that experience incredibly isolating. One student in one of the studies is quoted as saying, "The thing that was totally forgotten in this is any kind of contact among students or between students and faculty members. The faculty members seemed to feel the need to be a fire hose of knowledge. The street was all one way." Wow, couldn't say that better myself. The common response was to ignore the more interactive aspects of what online learning could be. And the good news is that this is a fixable problem. We now have some time to build in interactive elements into our online curriculum and not rely solely on lectures that were all one way. So that's a useful thing to think about as we're learning from what happened this spring. Another way to increase learner engagement is to share an exemplar of work if that's appropriate to what you're teaching. So, for example, if you're asking students to write a SOAP note, and that's an assignment in the online portion of your course or your session, you could provide a well-written exemplar too so that they could see what a good SOAP note looks like. That makes it a lot easier for them to engage in the task that you're asking them to do. And online content can often feel dry, it can often feel ugly, it can often feel boring. Students much prefer a learning environment that is pleasant and engaging. You need to be careful that it's not overly stimulating because that can add to cognitive noise, students being distracted by online elements. So, a lot of cute little dancing figures in the background is not such a great idea. This is also an area where Kate can help you and help you focus on, the kind of visual additions that aid you and the kind that kind of are distracting for students. Of course, we want to give and get feedback. That's an important part of online learning engagement. So, if we're teaching face-to-face, we tell students if their answers are correct. We add nuance if they gave a simplistic answer. We encourage them to dig deeper, to use their clinical reasoning skills. It's important to find ways to give that same level of quality feedback in an online learning environment. So it's also important to give substantive feedback when evaluating work, because students don't always have the opportunity to talk with you about why the work they submitted was subpar. So you all said this at the beginning, is that you don't have the same nonverbal clues that learners are confused or they're bored, or that you have when you're teaching a face-to-face class. So you can't automatically shift gears the way you can in a face-to-face course. So you need regular feedback from learners to know what's going on with them. The mid-course correction is often a really important element in an online course that we don't always do in face-to-face classes. Some people do, but many don't. Sort of stopping to ask, how is this working for you? Celebrate milestones. Even just saying in your weekly announcements, congratulations, you've completed 50% of the block, something like that, helps students see the light at the end of the tunnel, and it helps really show them that they're on a path. One of the things that can happen in a blended environment, like what we're going to be doing here at UCR and what we are already doing, is that students, the curriculum can suddenly feel very disjoint. It's like, okay, well, I'm here doing my clinical skills class one day, and then I'm supposed to be watching these videos online, and then I'm supposed to be out here doing LACE, and it can all feel very unrelated and very disjoint. So one of the things that you want to do in an online environment is you want to create that sense of continuity and unity across a block or a given session. So one way to do that is celebrate, significant milestones. Hey, you got through your first week. Congratulations, something that will help students see that that you're thinking about them. Also important to understand the whole student, seeing the learner as more than a medical student, getting a sense of who they are holistically, not just who they are when they're inside our classroom, inside our online learning environment, or inside the building. And one of the ways you do that, especially important, I think, in an asynchronous or in a synchronous learning session, is take a couple minutes to do check-ins at the beginning of the session. How's everybody doing? Maybe having a reflective question that they respond in the chat box, or some way to kind of check in on them before you launch into whatever the topic is. I think that's, we've all learned, right, in our Zoom meetings, how it's sometimes really helpful to have those couple of minutes before everybody arrives when you can just sort of chat informally, and it breaks that feeling of isolation and makes students feel like they're part of that learning community. And also, one thing I always recommend for any online learning course is a Q&A discussion forum. So learners need a place where they can ask questions. So you will benefit as much as the learners do, because their peers can often answer the question before you have to. And notice how, I don't know how well you can see this, but notice how the instructor frames the Q&A board, specifically encourages learners to email her if it's a private matter. And you also need to have some discussions where you are a participating member. So notice this instructor provides a few helpful boards, one for glitches, one's a student lounge before they go into actual discussions related to course content. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a couple of minutes. You need to monitor progress regularly. Keep on top of who is doing well and praise them publicly and privately. Quoting something a student said in a discussion thread in your announcement, for example, demonstrates that you are present, that you're paying attention, and that you value the student's contributions. Sending a private email to a student and praising them for an interesting point they made in class, whether it was a synchronous session or asynchronous part of your course, demonstrates that you see them as an individual and you value their contributions. You have to actually be more proactive when teaching in an online environment, because again, students can't see you either unless you've got on camera. So that's important. So you need to give some additional support. You know, students are alone, often alone, when they're engaging in their online content, whether they're at home or in a public space like Starbucks. They can't whisper to a peer or raise a hand to ask a quick question. And online teaching requires giving additional support to fight that feeling of isolation. You know, very first class I took online, you know, many years ago now, I screwed up and I turned in the wrong assignment. I turned in the assignment without uploading a file. So whenever students made a similar mistake, I always related that story back to them. And, you know, there's a learning curve to online learning on both sides. So, you know, it's an important thing to keep in mind. I hate that digital native cliche. Just because someone is young, it doesn't mean they're fully comfortable in an online learning environment. They may be familiar with the apps that they use every day, but they may be entering this world for the first time. So it can be confusing and stressful, particularly if you have a lot on the line. So online students often, as I said before, feel isolated. One of the things to think about is how you're having them introduce themselves. Now you've got 85 students in a class and you have 1 hour to do a synchronous session. Obviously you can't have time, you can't take time to have everybody introduce themselves. But what you can do is you can ask students to do something fun. You can ask like a subset of the students to post a picture at the beginning, take like 3 minutes to post a picture of their pet, or to do something that is a bit of an introduction, whether that's in an asynchronous session or a synchronous session. What are some ways that you can use icebreakers and activities to kind of break that feeling of isolation? What sort of games and things can you do? You don't have a lot of time, so you need to keep them brief, but you need to think about how you're going to kind of get them talking at the beginning of the session. So in an asynchronous online class, the introductories discussion board lays the foundation for that student-to-student conversation. Another community building forum you can include is a problem-solving forum. So you can dedicate, and again, if you're teaching synchronously in a Zoom session, you can dedicate a small amount of time to this and ask students to come and, you know, before the session, send out a message and say, I'm going to ask you to share, you know, one resource that you're using to study for the STEP exam, or some kind of activity that will allow students to come and help problem solve with each other issues that they may be having. One of the things that you can also ask is, you know, asking students how they're battling the feeling of isolation in online learning. What's helping them so that they can share those ideas and solve those problems together. And again, another forum could be dedicated strictly to sharing ideas about QI or projects that they're working on, resources around testing, like the USMLE. Another best practice is a cyber cafe or a student forum where they can just go off topic and talk to each other about anything related, whether it's related or not. It's been my experience that students often, when they're seeing each other face to face, they develop their own methods of communicating. So you don't always have to put that in there. So it's important to communicate, because the main interaction with an instructor is virtual. It's especially important that students receive a timely response. So if they've emailed you, the best practice is within 24 hours. Many instructors will check messages at least twice a day, especially during critical periods. So if they're prepping for the SHELF exam or something, they may want an answer more quickly. If you can't do that because maybe you're just teaching a one and done lecture, then consider having someone else who regularly checks for questions and then sends them to you if they need your input on them. The last thing you want is to log into the online learning site to, a week later when your next lecture comes up and find 50 panicked messages from students who couldn't get a response. Also, it's helpful to communicate to students what a reasonable expectation is for response. So if you're teaching solely online, put something about your response time in the syllabus or on the site somewhere. So, just put a message. I check messages every weekday before 5 p.m. I don't check on weekends or holidays, or whatever your policy would be. Do you want students to text you? Make that available to them. And often, students should be hearing something from someone throughout the week. Perhaps that's not you. Perhaps that's a block director. It's also important to use multiple channels. Instead of only posting your announcement in the announcement tool or putting something on the discussion board or sending it out by email, why not do all three? It doesn't take any more time to copy and paste it into different formats and send it out in every channel. So you want to use the site tools, even if you're teaching in a synchronous setting. If you've got follow-up questions and things students want to follow up, use the site tools. You'll be glad you did, because it keeps all the content organized. It's better than email because the system archives all the messages. So you can, in case you need to access it later, it's easier than having to search through a bunch of emails. It addresses all the online learning issues at one time. So rather than mixing them in with your work and personal emails, learners are still going to email you. No matter how many times I ask students to send me messages through the site, they would often email anyway. But you can still respond via the course site and encourage them to communicate that way as well. It's also really helpful for you when you go back and teach that session or that block again the next time, that you have now a record of questions and the way you answered those questions, and you can start building a frequently asked question page or other resources that you can make available for the next round of students. I keep skipping over slides, I'm not sure why. A key element for building community is human presence within the course. So as I said before, online learning can feel very isolating. So it's really important that students feel that sense of human presence. Regular communication shows students you're interested in them. The best online faculty, according to surveys from students, are faculty who show their presence multiple times per week, even daily. So again, if you're just doing a one and done lecture, that may not apply to you. But if you're a regular instructor throughout that block, they need to know you're there. Regular weekly announcements that reference current situations help learners know there's somebody in the class. So for example, hey, I hope you had a great holiday weekend, means I know you didn't just create a pat announcement and you reuse it for 5 years every time you taught the course. I know that you paid attention to what was going on at present. And when you do these announcements, you don't necessarily have to do them in real time. You can front load them and still, look at your calendar and say, oh, that's right after the 4th of July. Maybe I'll mention that in my announcement this week. Even better than a written announcement is a video announcement. I know some of you aren't comfortable on camera. Get over it. I know that sounds mean, but get over it. When teaching online, you have to get used to being on camera. You can also encourage students to turn on their cameras when appropriate. So as I said before, when you're teaching 80 students, having everyone with their camera on is not practical, and it may actually be just distracting for everyone. Some instructors have a policy when you go into a breakout session, the cameras go on and the mics go on. I was just working on a session I'm doing tomorrow for our fellowship didactic program, and I have a slide that says, mics on or off, that is the question. Because I know a lot of people say part of Zoom etiquette is everybody keeps their mic muted unless they're speaking. And I would say in a big meeting or a big session, that's absolutely critical. But in a smaller group, I find that it's better to have everyone with their mics open, unless there's a crying baby or unless there's a dog barking or something like that, because it allows for a more normal flow of conversation. You can hear people laugh. They can jump into the conversation a little more easily. And again, if you're teaching synchronously in a Zoom session, I'm violating this rule right now, so I should put my camera on because I'm telling you to do it, right? So you have to keep your camera on. Again, I'm opposed to a hard and fast rule about requiring students to keep their cameras on, but it is important to encourage it in some situations. Oh, here I have that same slide here, so I didn't even realize. Oops, I messed up here. Hold on just a second. There we go. We're almost out of time. So, if it's a small group, I would encourage you to consider asking everyone to keep their microphones on, unless there's something really, really distracting going on. So then you get rid of that. Jerry, you're muted every 10 minutes in the class when somebody is asking a question and they still have their mic muted. Obviously, if it's a large group, you ask everybody to keep their mics off unless they're talking, because there's too much background noise then. Reach out. Make sure the students know that you want them to connect with you. They appreciate that you cared enough to reach out. They feel less isolated. They feel less anonymous. I cannot tell you how many times over the years that since I've been teaching online, I've had students tell me that I was the first instructor to ever check in on them when they hadn't logged into the course or turned in an assignment or just checked in to see how they were doing. Again, that's something you would do probably quite naturally in a face-to-face session. As you just walk up to students, hey, how's it going? What's going on? I noticed that you're a little behind here. Is there something, I can do to help you? But maybe you wouldn't do that. And if not, you're probably a terrible teacher, so you probably didn't sign up for this session, because only good teachers sign up to actually do faculty development. So I know that's probably not you. So you need to kind of do that proactively when teaching asynchronously as well. And keep office hours. Actually, this is advice I would give whether you're teaching online or face-to-face. You can do it virtually or face-to-face, depending on the circumstances. Obviously, now we're doing everything virtually for good reason. But it's not enough just to have office hours. That's just step one. You have to announce them all the time. I mean, all the time. Don't forget, I have office hours this Wednesday. Encourage learners to attend. I expect to see everybody at office hours. Use humor. Free snacks to the first 5 students who show up to my office hours next week. Create incentives. I'll be giving out more tips on how to ace the shelf exam during my Friday office hours. So make a point of coming. So many professors, whether they're teaching online or face-to-face, use their office hours as free time. So they don't really encourage students to attend. That way, and they complain when students don't come and they fall back on that excuse. Well, hey, I told them to come to office hours if they had any questions. Students aren't dumb. They pick up on signals of whether or not you really want them to show up at office hours. If you send a clear and consistent message that you want them to come to office hours, trust me, they will come. And more importantly, even if they never show up to a single one of your office hours, they know you cared enough about them as a person and as a learner that you're there to support them in their learning. That's the most important reason to constantly remind students about the way you can contact me is this. Here's when I'm holding my office hours. Here's how you can reach me if you have any questions. Those kind of messages tell students, I'm here, I care, I want to help you with your learning. That is critically important. So I just want to finish up with just a few basic tips on online learning. And one is, you can never duplicate what you do in a face-to-face classroom online. It's impossible. It's completely different styles of teaching and learning, and it requires a whole new set of skills. Any attempt to duplicate what we're doing in classroom will just fail. So it simply just can't be done. You have to learn how to teach in a way that works in an online environment, and that's important. Another is, we're drifting a little into design here. into course design, which we'll be talking about in another session. But in online learning, design and teaching are inextricably linked. In face-to-face teaching, if you are a gifted teacher, students may learn from you even if your courses aren't well designed. It's unlikely, but it is possible. However, in an online learning environment, design and teaching are fused. They cannot be separated. Decide what you want your students to focus on. There are just so many distractions when we're online. A course site that's cluttered or difficult to navigate creates additional cognitive load for students and makes it harder for them to use that energy for learning. The same thing is true when you're designing your videos, your slides, your written content, whether you're teaching synchronously or asynchronously. You may not be there to point them to the key points. You have to find other ways to identify what is the most important content. And I know Kay has some great suggestions for that, of ways of color coding your slides or creating an icon that indicates this is important content. You should pay extra attention to this. Not that everything you're teaching is obviously important, but some things are more important than others, and you need to have them focus on those things. The most important way to create focus in your online course is by building around clear, specific, and measurable learning outcomes. An article in Inside Higher Education, which was the lessons learned from spring, faculty members who built their in-person sessions around specific learning outcomes had a much easier time translating to an online environment because they knew what was most important and what they should focus on. So, learning outcomes create clear expectations for both you and the learners. Students can use the learning outcomes to identify what the most important content is. You can use the learning outcomes to narrow in on what's most important, reduce the amount of work that you give students, and eliminate anything that is extraneous so that, understand what all the other things that we're all juggling right now. So, when you're organizing your online content, be intuitive, make it easy for students to move from one thing to another. Use student preview if you're teaching in an asynchronous online environment. Always click that button that says view it in student mode so that you see it the way the students are seeing it. Really important. Add verbal and written instructions. Is it clear what the student has to do to access the content? For example, do they need to click on a link to open up the lesson? If so, you may want to include click on the link to access lesson content. That may seem obvious to you, but it may not be obvious to them. Do they have to click on an arrow to go to the next slide? Or do they have to hit submit to complete a knowledge check? Explain those things and make sure it's easy early on. Once we've got more into this and it's become more of the norm, students will figure that out and we won't need to do that so explicitly. But especially at the beginning, it's important that we create as many signposts as possible. And as you're structuring, if you're structuring an online course, and again, Kay can help you with this, think about how the menus, modules, folders, pages, and other elements help or hinder a student's progress. So we're going to be coming to you very soon with surveys and asking you questions about the way we're organizing the online content because we're creating an official UCR template. So this is something for you to think about. You want to always have a balance between clicks and scrolls and folders. So students should be able to access material without having to click through more and more and more links, nor should they be like a one-page website where they have to scroll and scroll and scroll to find things, or a maze of folders. And again, if that seems like way too much for you to figure out, don't forget that's why we have an instructional designer to help you get through that. And now I'm seeing that our time is up, so I'm going to skip over some of this and just go right to the end. And just let me finish with, don't forget that we are here for you. Don't try to go it alone. Get the help you need. One of the things we can do for you is help you create your online content so that some of the things we're talking about, we can help you do that. We can provide on-demand training, either one-on-one or in small groups, on how to use the learning management system, how to do things in Zoom, how to teach online, how to clarify learning outcomes for your online portion of your content. We can also give advice. We can come to your faculty meetings and we can give insights on the most effective ways to teach. you know, all of those things we can do for you. We can also provide tutorials. I really want to make a point of this before everybody takes off, because I got asked in a faculty meeting, please, please, please create a tutorial on how to make a video. So I did it. I gave up my whole weekend to make it. And I pushed it out on Monday. And I specifically said in the email, please let me know, is this the kind of thing you need? And let me know what other tutorials of this nature you want. And while I had gotten enormous pressure in that meeting, we need this so desperately, not one person responded and said, yes, this is what I need, or no, what I really needed was this. So we want to provide the resources you need. So if you say, you know, Rosemary, what I could really use is somebody to show me how to do this. I can make a tutorial, like a 5-minute video tutorial explaining how to do that, or I can meet with you and show you how to do that, but I can't read your mind on what you're struggling with. So we need you to do that. Obviously, we have lots of upcoming learning opportunities. We're getting very popular. So we've got lots and lots of things happening, including our Teaching Essentials series, our clinical teaching series. We've got a new series for residents, Resident as Teacher series. So if you're working with residents, this is open to anyone, even if you're not one of our resident programs, but you're at an affiliated site. We have a special event with Women in Medicine and Science. Dr. Allison Whelan, who's the Chief Medical Education Officer at the AAMC, will be speaking 2 different times, either at 11 or at 5. Our Teaching Excellence Academy graduates will be presenting their research at a conference on teaching and learning on the 26th. And so on. Oh, also, we're doing a session with our wellness person on combating Zoom fatigue at the end of this month. So, as always, you can go. Kay has put the links into the box about where you can find all this. As a UCR faculty member, if you're interested, you receive a 50% discount on your tuition for this program, which is a professional earned certificate in medical education. If you want to know more about that, just give me a call. And I'm happy to stay on and answer any questions that you have about online teaching that I didn't cover, or things that maybe just pertain to you. And I just want to say again, thank you so much. I know it's a big ask for you to give up time on your evening, and I appreciate that you took the time and you care enough about our students to do that. Kay also put in the box the evaluation link. So please takes just a couple of minutes to let us know. And again, don't be afraid to say, you know, this was fine, but what I really wanted was this. That's the only way we know what kind of content to provide for you. So thank you again. I'm happy to stay. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the box or unmute and just ask.